Hello, I'd like to share with you one of my favorite Valentine stories by an author called Eileen Spinelli, entitled Somebody Loves You, Mr. Hatch. The pictures are by Paul Yalowitz. And this is how the story goes. Mr. Hatch was tall and thin, and he did not smile. Every morning at 6:30 sharp, he would leave his brick house and walk 8 blocks to the shoelace factory where he worked. At lunchtime, he would sit alone in a corner, eat his cheese and mustard sandwich, and drink a cup of coffee. Sometimes he brought a prune for dessert. And then after work, he would walk over and make 2 stops, one at the newsstand to get a paper, and at the grocery store to buy a fresh turkey wing for his supper. Then after supper, he read the paper, took a shower, and went to bed early. He keeps himself to himself. That's what everyone said about Mr. Hatch. One Saturday afternoon, though, when Mr. Hatch stepped onto the porch with his dustpan and broom, he got quite a surprise. A package wrapped in brown paper. He had never spoken to the postman before, but he said, "Thank you, Mr. Goober." And Mr. Goober smiled. "Well, you're most welcome. I always enjoy delivering packages." Mr. Hatch tore the brown paper off, and inside was a white box, which he opened to find another box. This one was heart-shaped, all satiny red with a pink bow on top. It was filled with candy. Something fluttered to the porch floor, and it was a little white card. He picked it up, and it said, "Somebody loves you." Only then did he remember that today was Valentine's Day. Mr. Hatch wondered and wondered. Now, who would send this to me? He was all alone. He had no friends, and yet someone had sent him a valentine. Who? Who could this be? He put the box on the coffee table and tried to do some dusting, but every time he left the room, he had to keep peeking to see if the box was still there. He dusted and dusted, and the dust cloth seemed to whisper, "Somebody loves you. Somebody loves you." And at last he flung the dust cloth away and exclaimed, "Well, I've got a secret admirer." And then he did something he had never done before. He laughed. He laughed, and he danced, and he clapped his hands, and then he took a piece of candy from the box and ate it. Mr. Hatch changed his shirt and found some old aftershave in the bottom drawer. He splashed it on his face. He picked out a yellow tie with blue polka dots and put it on, and then he went for a walk. Maybe, he thought, I will meet the person who sent me the candy. Of course, no one had ever seen Mr. Hatch wearing a tie or smelling of aftershave or smiling for that matter, so he got a lot of attention. Mrs. Weed tripped over her dog. Mr. Dunwoody nearly fell off his ladder. And little Tina Finn spilled all the toys out of her wagon. Mr. Hatch waved hello to all of them. What a surprise. Now on Monday, it was back to work. And at lunchtime, Mr. Hatch sat in the middle of the cafeteria. He spoke to everyone and passed out chocolates from his heart box. On the way home, as usual, he stopped at the newsstand. Mr. Smith handed him the usual newspaper. "I think I'll have a pack of mints," said Mr. Hatch. That was not usual. Mr. Smith was shocked. "Was that you speaking, Mr. Hatch?" "Indeed it was. And I said I would like also to have a pack of mints, if you don't mind my saying so, though. Mr. Smith, you don't look very well today." Mr. Smith recovered from his shock to reply, "You're right. I don't feel very well at all. I have a cold. I was supposed to go to the doctor's this afternoon, but the stand has been so busy I haven't had the time." Mr. Hatch smiled. "Well, I'd be happy to watch the stand for you while you go." Mr. Smith could hardly believe his ears. "You would?" "Well, certainly. Just show me what to do." And so Mr. Hatch ran the newsstand for an hour. He wondered if any of the women who stopped by to buy a paper or a magazine or a candy bar had sent him the mysterious Valentine. Could it be? Now, when Mr. Smith returned, Mr. Hatch made his usual stop at the grocery store. "I'm a little tired of turkey wings," he told Mr. Todd. "I think I'll have a nice fresh slice of ham." So Mr. Todd weighed the meat and wrapped it. "You look worried, though," said Mr. Hatch. "I am," said Mr. Todd. "My little girl is late. She hasn't come home from school yet, and I can't leave the store to look for her until my wife arrives." "Well, goodness, why didn't you say so?" said Mr. Hatch. "I'll go look for her." And so he walked to school and found little Melanie Todd by the swings and brought her home. Thank you, said the grocer. "Any time," said Mr. Hatch. After supper, Mr. Hatch did not bother to read the paper. He decided to bake brownies instead. It would be nice to have brownies to share the next day with the people at the shoelace factory. As he baked, the warm chocolate smell of brownies floated through the neighborhood, and children gathered around Mr. Hatch's house, sniffing the air. "Well, I suppose the factory can wait," said Mr. Hatch as he looked out the window, and he brought out 2 platefuls of brownies. "Now, what are brownies without lemonade?" he said, so he stirred up a nice cold pitcher of that too. When the parents came to gather the children, they had some brownies too, and it turned out to be quite a picnic in Mr. Hatch's backyard. He dusted off an old harmonica, and he played songs he remembered from his boyhood, and everybody danced. And so the days and weeks went by. When Mr. Hatch wasn't smiling, he was laughing, and when he wasn't laughing, he was helping someone. And when he wasn't helping someone, he was having a party in his yard or on his porch. He seemed to have forgotten about finding the person who sent him the Valentine. And then one afternoon, Mr. Goober the postman came to his door. His face was very serious. "Well, come in, Mr. Goober," said Mr. Hatch. "You look upset." "I am upset," he said. "I've made a terrible mistake some time ago, and my supervisor's very angry with me." Do you... Yes, Mr. Goober, what is it? "Do you recall the package I delivered to you? I think it was on Valentine's Day." "Oh, yes, I believe so," replied Mr. Hatch, beginning to feel a little uneasy. "I don't suppose you still have it," said Mr. Goober sadly. "As a matter of fact, I do," said Mr. Hatch. "I still have the box, but I'm afraid the candy is all gone. Why do you ask?" The postman took a deep breath. "I'm afraid I delivered it to the wrong address. It was supposed to go to another house." Mr. Hatch recalled tearing off the brown paper. It had never occurred to him to look at the address. He fetched the heart-shaped box and the pink bow and gave them to the postman. "I do hope your supervisor won't be too angry with you now." The postman was heading down the sidewalk when Mr. Hatch called from his porch. "Mr. Goober, I forgot something." And he gave the postman the little white card. "Somebody loves you." Alone in his living room, Mr. Hatch sighed. Nobody loved me after all. Then he read the paper, took a shower, and went to bed early. The next morning at 6:30 sharp, Mr. Hatch left his brick house and walked 8 blocks to the shoelace factory. At lunchtime, he sat in the corner by himself, ate his cheese and mustard sandwich, and just had a cup of coffee. Not a very happy guy. After work, He stopped at the newsstand for his paper, but he did not speak to Mr. Smith. And when he ordered his turkey wing for Mr. Todd, he did not smile. He didn't pat little Melanie Todd on the head or bake brownies or have picnics or parties or play his old harmonica either. Everybody whispered, "What is wrong with Mr. Hatch?" And then Mr. Goober told them. "But we love Mr. Hatch," insisted Mr. and Mrs. Dunworthy. "He gave us flowers for our garden. He helped to mend our back fence." Mrs. Weed nodded. "I love him too. He gave bones for my dog Ruffy, and Ruffy barked she loved Mr. Hatch too." Mr. Smith told everyone how Mr. Hatch had watched his newsstand so he could visit the doctor. And Mr. Todd told everyone how Mr. Hatch had found his little girl. All the children in the neighborhood remembered Mr. Hatch's wonderful brownies and the lemonade, and most of all, his laughter. "Poor Mr. Hatch," they said. "What can we do?" And then Mr. Goober announced, "I have an idea." That's a light bulb. I think that's what happens when you get a bright idea. And this is what they did. Can you guess? On Saturday morning, Mr. Hatch woke to a bright and sunny day. He put on his old overalls and went out to the porch with his dustpan and broom, and he couldn't believe his eyes. All over the porch were red and white hearts and pink bows. There were boxes of candy on the chairs and yellow streamers floating from the ceiling, and sticking up out of his mailbox was a shiny silver harmonica. The front yard was filled with people, happy, smiling people, and they were holding up a huge sign with hand-painted letters, and it said, "Everybody loves Mr. Hatch." Mr. Hatch dabbed at a tear with his handkerchief. "I do believe," he said, "that somebody does love me after all." And then he smiled, and then he laughed, and then he hurried down to be with his friends. I hope you enjoyed this story by Eileen Spinelli. And I like how really Mr. Hatch had to start being friendly to all the people around him in order to find all the friends that he had in his neighborhood. And I was thinking, if you have somebody that you would like to surprise and give a Valentine gift to, you can make a very simple Valentine out of some construction paper. I made this by first taking a piece of paper, folding it in half in order to make a heart that is the same on both sides, drawing half of it. Then I opened it out, and I used that as a pattern to cut out my 2 red hearts. And to use the idea of Mr. Hatch working in a shoelace factory, I used a shoelace. This is from a sneaker, one of the long shoelaces, about 45 inches. And then I just started stitching around here. You can write whatever message you want in the middle. And then you can fill it with some candy. And I just used Hershey Kisses. So you can put 2 or 3 of them in there. And then just stitch it closed, like so. And tie it up and tie a bow there and surprise somebody with a Valentine. I'd also like to encourage you to check out some of her other books. She's written quite a few, but a fun one I found by Eileen Spinelli is Buzz. It's about a bee who learns that bees really are not designed aerodynamically to fly. And so by learning that, she thought she couldn't fly. So she had to start believing in herself and having the confidence that she had flown so she could fly again. That's quite a cute story. Another one, another insect story, is called Sophie's Masterpiece, in which a spider weaves the most intricate designs in her web and ends up making a very special design at the end. But as I said, she has lots of other stories, and her husband too, Jerry Spinelli, is an author. So check out both of their books in your library. And I hope you have a great Valentine's Day.